fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. You get a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone fixed me on it. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Welcome back to Varn Blog, and today we're talking to Matt Cavagrotti, and we are talking about the many trials and tribulations of the Federal Reserve. Where we last ended on our intrepid adventure, which will be a couple days ago for our listeners and viewers, but will have only been a few minutes for us, is the Fed doesn't know anything, part 3, or as I like to call it, the Federal Reserve 2, Electric Boogaloo, and everything falls apart. So we have realized now that the Fed doesn't seem to know what's going on. Even it does some of the same things with different explanatory mechanisms, partly because those are the only things it's really chartered to do. Like, it can't do certain things. And so we have this kind of wild situation where the Fed was, what QE did more than injecting money was soak up toxic assets. It just took them out, and they were like basically like all these little fiscal bombs. They basically put in their Fed bunker and let explode on them, and contained it from the rest of the economy, while also increasing liquidity. As we have said, we cannot prove that, and it's highly debated if QE was the direct causer of inflation. There are people in the Fed who have argued that it is. There are people in the Fed who have argued that it is not.
Vehemently deny.
Yeah, vehemently deny that it has had any relationship to inflation. Furthermore, the Democrats made a whole lot of progressive promises in 2000 that they kind of sort of put into practice, not really at all, but they threw some money at some things. Like,
sounds familiar.
Right. So, the Fed's chair will always expire 1 year into the new president's term, so it can be radically transformed at short notice. Remember Warren's "don't repeat Powell" argument. So let's talk about that. What was Elizabeth Warren going on about with the "don't repeat Powell"?
Well, there was a trading scandal within the Fed. There were a number of individuals within the Fed who had sold millions of dollars worth of stock while serving. The actual president of the Fed, Bostic, retired at the time, and it wasn't even anything nearly as egregious as like what members of Congress do, like Nancy Pelosi just straight up buying calls on Tesla. I think that what they sold were mostly like ETFs, like the S&P 500 and stuff, and it wasn't even in such large quantities that it suggested that it's something that they might not otherwise do. But nonetheless, it was a bad look, and Elizabeth Warren, always eager to increase her progressive accolades, advocated against Jerome Powell's reappointment, arguing that a culture of corruption, quote unquote, had been enabled on his watch. But that just gives you an idea of just kind of how quickly the story can change with the Fed. If every first year reappointment, it can essentially be gutted, and reappointments were made. New appointments were made under Biden. And so I'm sure that was a consideration for Jerome Powell as the chair of the Fed when it comes to his willingness or ability to raise interest rates earlier if he had an inclination that he was wrong and that
I mean, like, it would look like he was deliberately undermining the president while the president is talking about trying to pass infrastructure stimulus.
Yeah, and you're just not going to do that, and you know, unless you want to get fired,
right? So since he was up for term, there was no way he was going to do it. Economists did not agree that the inflation was going to be a major macroeconomic concern, as we already discussed. MMTers and a lot of Keynesians thought high inflation rate might even be good for admittedly for a brief period of time to devalue some debts. So, you know, conservative critics of the central bank, known as monetarists, for their adherence to the writings of Milton Friedman. So let's actually talk about this. I'm reading off some of our notes here. So how did the monetarists respond in 2011? They didn't also seem to be that. In fact, I was listening to economics. I listen to economics podcasts all the time because, you know, I'm a Marxist and economics should be a large part of what we look at. Also, I can often predict political trends based off the market, like way better than the other way around. So
except under Trump, anytime he said anything about, you know, like tensions with China or anything antagonistic towards China, it was pretty much a sure bet that the market wasn't going to respond kindly.
Yes, true.
But other than that,
so Friedman says inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, not a fiscal policy phenomenon, which is an interesting thing. And so Friedman advocates that central bankers should prevent the supply of money from growing faster than economic output. That's how you can basically moderate against the excesses of the business cycle, according to Milton Friedman. Now, I should point out, though, that like in conservative economics, and even under the stuff we call neoliberalism, so that's going to be your von Hayek's, etc. This was actually somewhat controversial because it is state interventionist. It's not just state interventionist in the market, except in the money market, right? Like that is. And so for people like von Mises are the ordo liberals in America, that word means something else in Europe. This is bad. Like, I mean, von Mises called von Hayek's concession to monetarism signs that von Hayek was a communist. That always amuses the shit out of me.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that particularly I think in the early economic crisis, a lot of people didn't realize that, unless you were someone like an economic historian like Philip Murawski, didn't realize that neoliberalism was different from entrepreneurial liberalism. They just thought it was deregulation of the markets. But what it actually was this whole creation of semi-market instruments and public-private partnerships and the state creating markets where they weren't one, which ironically led to less people being employed by the state, but the size of the state actually growing exponentially larger than it did under either social democracy or Fordism or Keynesian policies prior. So, which is a weird irony, right? Okay, but that's the general conservative consensus, though, is the Milton is like, we will say the Friedman monetarist stance or the Chicago school stance. Austrians are distrustful of this because they don't think the Fed can successfully regulate money, which is why so many people like Rand and Ron Paul are into the gold standard, which is hilarious.
Yeah,
whole different hilarious problem, but yeah, that's why. So that's one. Those are the two major schools of conservative economics. Basically, you have gold buggers who think the Friedmanites are basically probably crypto communist, and you have the Friedmanite monetarists. Then Powell's interesting. All right.
Yeah, it's tough to peg him It's tough to peg what he really believes, because this whole time I suspect that he knew that the line that he was giving was wrong, but that he continued to do it anyway.
So I've always read Jerome Powell as a conservative Keynesian in his actual governing.
Yeah. Yeah, he's I forget who it was in the 60s. I said, Americans are conservative. What are they conservative about? The New Deal.
Right. So Powell says that the Fed's money printing is not fueling today's price spiral, which of course leftist economists, and we'll go over the leftist economic theory from 2008 forward to now. But of course, leftist economists like that about Powell, that, you know, he emphasizes disruptions associated with reopening the economy, like we talked about. He's also emphasized the strength of the labor market a lot. And so he thinks we have to weaken the labor market a little bit, but, you know, he wants it to be a soft reset. He was originally talking about continuing the recovery, which I found is interesting, because I'm like, are we still claiming we're recovering from 2008?
Yeah, he gave the concept of recovering from COVID a really wide berth. And I understand that the implications of COVID are going to continue to ripple out for years, if not decades to come. But at least by conventional metrics, he seems to have worn, for lack of a better phrase, worn out his welcome a bit when it comes to insisting that inflation wasn't a problem and not raising rates sooner.
Right. So then Powell also says that financial deregulations and innovations such as interest-bearing checkings account, which often have better rates than savings accounts, which is hilarious. And certain kinds of new mutual fund instruments meant that, you know, traditional measures of the money supply don't really predict price trends anymore.
And this goes back to this goes back to the Volcker. Especially beginning with Greenspan, you have people who insist that because of these complex, like, financial derivatives, and the reconfigured relationship there, that the way that the Fed measures, like, the effect of increasing or decreasing the M2 money supply is no longer in the same way, and so they've developed a new set of metrics.
Right. So, and one of the things that I found funny is, like, when you measure M2, you don't measure mutual funds, which is wild. That's another funny. There's all kind of people who get into finance and this economic stuff deeply. You start realizing how many government measurement instruments are weird. Just weird.
Yeah.
Like when I was like, okay, I get why housing and maybe medical costs aren't in general inflation, because it would make the general inflation seem insane. But why isn't food? Like, why isn't food in the consumer price index? Like, is food not? And the reason why is, in theory, food demand is inelastic.
Right.
Like, your caloric needs don't really change, which is a weird way to think about food in the United States, given how many ways we have to meet those caloric needs. But whatever. So Jerome Powell says, okay, like, between deregulation and new innovations and the algorithm thing we talked about that really fucked things up in 2007, we no longer really know what the actual M2 money supply is.
Right.
Now, during this time period leading up to Powell, there were shifts in left-wing economics too. So we talked about the right wing. Actually, let's talk about the center. So in the center, which would be both Chicago and, let's say, monetarist friendly orthodox Keynesians, or what might be called neo-orthodox Keynesians or new orthodox Keynesians, because while they believe in Keynesian flow forms, they do not. Keynes believed you regulated money by taxation, which is different than Friedman. So that's another thing I think people like. So, for example, when Keynes talks in the 1920s about how you should handle inflation, even if it leads to a little bit of unemployment, but he's talking about taxing to the point of a little bit of unemployment. to suck up the money. He's not talking about central banks playing with interest rates. So, but the kind of new orthodox Keynesians that emerged in I think the 80s and 90s, take what Keynes says about about money supply in regards to taxation and apply it to the bank-to-bank lending rate and the Federal Reserve, because taxation is a political thing explicitly and cannot be done by fiat, and thus no one wants to rely on taxation as their primary instrument arm, because you'd have to get basically political parties to do it, and it will, as Bush Sr. found out, will always be unpopular no matter what. That was the last time, really, was in the early 1990s, when anybody tried to control the money supply in the United States through taxation. And since Bush was kind of crushed by the Perot-Clinton pincer, it has been a forever no-go since then. Which is interesting, because even Democrats, despite all they're talking about taxing the rich or whatever, they don't really do it, ever. They will do stuff like what they've done, like increase reporting requirements. And by the way, when they said that the reporting requirements wouldn't affect poor people, they were lying, because if you get paid, if you're a gig economy worker and you accept anything through PayPal, that's now going to generate a 1099 at a much lower threshold than it used to. Now, technically, you were always supposed to report that money, but now you have to. So, and you might even have to report it twice, depending on how you take it.
Oh, God.
So have fun with it.
Yeah.
Trust me, I know I'm a podcaster. But because I had to change how I cashed out my own money so that I didn't get two 1099s for the same amount of money.
Yeah, getting double tax sucks.
Yep. So, and it's very, very hard. There are ways around it, but you basically need to to not get double taxed, but you basically need to hire a accountant to show you how to deduct the cost of your taxes from the other costs from the other part of your taxes, which you probably can't do as an individual and not have the IRS on your butt. So, yeah. So there's people who think that those kind of little tweaks don't matter. And if they applied to any bank transaction, they would have led to massive double taxing. Because the reason why people were so upset, and I don't think people realized it, that if it generated a 1099 when $650 came into your bank account, and it generates a 1099 when $650 goes into your PayPal account, and you cash your PayPal account into your bank account, you're going to get double taxed.
Oh, God.
But they removed the $650 for the threshold for generating a 1099 now is pretty high for bank accounts, but not for stuff like PayPal. But then there's weird stuff also about how you label it. So whatever, whether or not something's labeled. When someone sends you something now through PayPal or Zelle, if they label it as a transaction versus just sending money, it changes the tax code.
Yeah.
Just so people know. Anyway.
So, it also gains you some consumer protection, but, if you've ever actually tried to get a refund through PayPal for any reason or another, you better do it in that first 24 hours. That's all I have to say.
So let's talk about, what did the center, though? What did this kind of neo-Orthodox Keynesian / Chicago School Center agree on about the Fed? Because you said many economists, but I think this is interesting. So I think this is kind of the consensus right now, but there really isn't a consensus. So this is just probably the largest opinion, right? What is the normal current economist view of the Fed's printing and inflation with M2?
The Fed didn't increase inflation because while it may have increased the empty money supply, the velocity of the transmission of that money decreased. In other words, that's also to say that, like, there's a great, yes, it's true that there's like a great deal more money now stored in various forms, but apparently it's moving through the economy more slowly than at any time in the last 50 or 60 years.
But meaning people aren't buying shit.
Yeah. And so, part of the problem is that the big chunk of all of that new money wasn't spent. The financial institutions that received it for their bonds, they just used that money, and it was a lot of money, like $2 trillion. They just put it in their accounts at the central bank. While American households, bank much of their stimulus checks, and they're now sitting on like an estimated $2.7 trillion in savings.
Until the beginning of this year, actually was
going
to talk about that.
And now I'm sure they're dipping in. They're dipping in, for sure.
Yeah, now they're dipping in it because also debt. We had
the reason. Yeah. That's exactly right. The ratio of consumer debt also increased. So we know that the people who had already applied that money to their debt and that it didn't alleviate all of it, or I guess just people who didn't apply that to their debt at all, they are now, tightening the old financial belt and adding debt. And so that's the reason that we know that the people who are not in it are now dipping into savings to avoid doing that.
Which, by the way, is why Biden won't do a goddamn thing one way or another about student loans, because he knows it's a fucking time bomb. No matter what he does with it, it's a time bomb. Why is it a time bomb if he forgives it? Well, those student loan debt is collateralized, my friends. It's not just, people make money off that. It's in pension funds. It's an investment.
Yeah.
So if they just forgave it, I guess they could pay that out, but it's gonna short a lot of pension funds and whatnot. It's also going to piss off the Democrats' most reliable voter base, university admin. So
no kidding. And it's also speculated that if he were to do the $10,000 in relief that he wanted, I guess since some persons of color have disproportionately taken on like lower amounts of debt.
Amounts of debt because they entered college and didn't complete it. That's
and so that would have the effect of helping them with regards to inflation. But it's estimated that if you were to actually implement that like it would only knock inflation down like a quarter or a half point at best. So take that with a grain of salt, but for what you will.
So basically, but this is kind of the thing is when those student loans kick back in, a whole lot of young middle class and lower middle class people are going to be underwater.
Yeah. And that happens soon, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's supposed to happen in August. So how I knew that Biden is not going to forgive the debts like he floated around, even that in that small amount. And I know some leftists think he might. And I'm like, nope, he's not going to do it because A, he floated it around first, which was to get your hopes up. And B, the education secretary about a couple weeks ago said they might extend the payback period again.
Yeah.
Which of course they are, because they're not going to have it pop off in August right before fucking midterm.
Exactly, is what this comes down to, is the timing of election cycles.
Yeah, so this will probably but after that, unless Biden just wants to set up a time bomb for whatever GOP president comes after him, he's going to have a hard time not doing something one way or the other and just maintaining the status quo.
I mean, the Democrats are screwed in November. I mean, I think that much is clear.
Yeah, I think they're screwed. It's like, are they screwed like they were in 2002?
No, they're screwed. They're screwed close to how the Republicans were in 2000 and 2008. Maybe not quite so bad because people haven't been subjected they haven't been psychologically berated by the war on terror, but they do feel violated by paying twice as much for gas. So.
Right, and when liberal elites, and I hate using that term, but it's true. I've had several liberal elites when I was like, look at right. I actually pointed out like inflation's higher than the gas per barrel ratio should indicate, right?
It's
like
the same people. Yeah, it's the same people who insisted that like we can't reopen the economy, and they just assume that everyone else has like a high paying like white collar job that you can work from home.
Right, and so when they were like, well, the gas is better under Biden, I'm like, I don't think people care. And also, frankly, the only thing I can see that would change gas quality is some safety regulations that were undone by the NEPA that have been reinstated. Okay, that's good. I don't know how much that would affect prices, though. And then you opt the ethanol ratio, which I do not have any evidence does good things for gas, good things for gas mileage, or good things for the overall carbon in the atmosphere, because it takes more carbon to make ethanol than it does to process gasoline. So
careful. Don't want to upset the climate catastrophists.
Well, I'm just pointing out that if the climate catastrophists are correct, and I would say you probably consider me a climate catastrophist myself, but I'm not totally. But one of the things I'm always like, ethanol's stupid. You can't fix anything with that, and like it's not anyway. So.
Right.
But it led to increased gas prices. Plus, you have the pipeline regulations, which I, again, don't feel one way or the other. So let's talk about the left discourse. Now, what's funny about economics and left-wing economics is from the Atari Democrats forward. So for those of you who don't speak like old people, like myself, and Atari Democrats are the Democrats that came to power in the DNC between 1982 and Bill Clinton in 1992. So that's like Gary Hart, that's Bob, what's his face? There's the people who thought that you had to move away from the labor left, and thought that basically that there was no electoral strategy with the labor left, that blue collar labor had dropped to too low of a percentage of the population. It is about 13%, by the way.
At this time.
It's actually gone up a little bit. So that was the dominant discourse. Marxists during that time were either Soviet apologists or they were in academia and they weren't talking about economics.
Yeah.
There were debates going on between people like Anwar Shaikh and Shafra and Kleiman, who will come up later today, but they were pretty much completely removed from even most Marxist discourse, and definitely from left discourse on economics at all. In fact, I've been going back and rereading a lot of Christopher Lasch's 80s writing, and it's weird how economicalists, because he's talking about this, how like you read leftists and they're just not talking about economics really that much at all during the late 80s, early 90s. It's quite strange.
It is strange. I'm sure it's at least in no small part due to like the scuttling of like the independent, the experiments in like independent working class politics as an outgrowth of like, the last great wave of like working class militancy in the United States in the 1970s.
So basically, like working class militancy ticks up in the 70s. I think people forget this because you have a bunch of wildcat strikes, but the wildcat strikes, interestingly, are mostly aimed at the government. Which I think people forget. Like they're not actually private sector wildcat strikes. Like the post office, like really militant post office strikes on like Nixon, for example. But then weirdly, almost as fast as it came back, it goes away. So this leads us to the 2008 left discourse. Okay. So what we've had, I've been mentioning all over again, you've had these monetarist, orthodox Keynesian hybrid people, of which Paul Krugman used to represent the left. Larry Summers kind of represents the right wing of that. And they were, by and large, the Democrats' response to neoliberalism, which was like neoliberal Keynesianism, as opposed, which is a weird thing to think, because a lot of leftists would have you believe that's not possible. But we'll get to that. But we start seeing economics discourse again. Now, I think in the early aughts, the primary far left economic discourse is anti-consumerism, a la Naomi Klein, no logo,
Right.
Which is moralistic AF. Kind of wants to return to pre-new Keynesianism, so they want their 1950s and 60s back. Basically, particularly for like the shock doctrine.
Yeah, there's a sort of like commodity.
But go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's like some sort of like commodity fetishism on the left at this time, like affinity for like exchange value.
Yeah,
excuse me, affinity for like use value over exchange value, and
like profits not people, which people not profits was the big thing. There's also this weird, like what was weird if you like go back and read 2005 to 2007 left discourse on economics, and I think Naomi Klein's emblematic of this. They're calling for a new Keynesian, basically for a return to Keynesian policy. In a big way. For protectionism in a big way. From the altered globalization movement, which I think people forget because
they like to.
But I'm like, no, they're calling for some pretty strict capital regulations. The initial response to all the trade deals at the end of the Bush administration up through the Obama administration by a lot of these people is no. We should be doing these trade deals. And what's weird is basically, I think because of Trump, this has all been erased from history. No one wants to they held this position.
Quite conveniently.
And so, but the response, there's finally a Marxist economic response to justify Marx, but we don't have any proletarian movements. There's no merger thesis. The Soviet Union's dead. What's funny is now people will try to argue that China was socialist, but I didn't know a single person, including any Maoist in 2008, 2009, who would have argued that China was socialist. And like I said, including every Maoist I knew. They'd argue that maybe the DPRK was socialist or that Cuba was socialist, but no one was arguing about China. So in steps these debates. David Harvey, who was famous in academic circles for a rather, I think, not super great history of neoliberalism that basically paints it as a political conspiracy and lays it at the feet of Reagan, something that I hope our discussion today has disabused people. Neoliberalism, you have the first signs of it actually in the Kennedy administration, and it really happens under Carter. But whatever. Definitely wasn't. It wasn't just Reagan. So you have David Harvey and Andrew Kleinman. Let's start with David Harvey, because David Harvey does something leading up to Occupy that no one had really seen done, and he records his lectures on Capital Volume 1 and makes them publicly available for free. Before that was common.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, their first exposure to Karl Marx outside of the manifesto are these 2008, 2009 David Harvey videos, and their prior exposure to left-wing economics would have been Elizabeth Warren before her Senate campaign doing videos and articles in these same circles that are anti-consumerist. And so that's a lot of people's movement. They get Elizabeth Warren in the mid-aughts, and then these Marxists who have been, and they're all old, they're all boomers, but who have been totally marginalized, and no one even on the left has been talking about them forever.
All of their organizations have undergone like 6 or 7 different splits over.
Yeah, between like 70 and 2008. And David Harvey steps on the scene using YouTube and podcasts and released this series that would become a series of books that has people talking about capital again. But what is his thesis, Matt? Because I think this is hilarious. Like, people have to go back to this time period because basically neoliberalism, big, scary, bad, and then what were happening in 2007. What is David Harvey? How does he explain it?
As far as I can gather, Harvey's central thesis in the book that he published, like right as the financial crisis is setting on. So I think it was in like 2007. But anyway, there were premonitions of this, and his whole thesis is that crises are never resolved fundamentally, but only move.
Right, which I guess is basically like the crisis of 2007 is really the crisis of the 1970s in slow motion.
Yeah.
And then he says a bunch of mumbo jumbo about the internal contradictions of capital. Now, I say, as a defender of the dialectical method, I actually do think there's a lot of good in dialectical methodology and understanding contradictions. But what David Harvey calls a contradiction of capital, I kind of felt like was like what Alanis Morissette would call ironic.
It's not really actually ironic.
Yeah, this is not also actually a contradiction. This is just something weird that you're noticing, David Harvey. The other thing is Harvey's not an economist. He's a geographer by training, and he doesn't also have a theory of value at all. He rejects labor theory of value, but doesn't seem to replace it with anything. He's not a marginalist. He's not an endogenous money person, really. He's not like an MMTer, although they don't really. MMT and neo-chartalism is developing in this time period, but it wouldn't really be what we think about it for a while. Okay, so that's the first thing. Not very satisfying. You think it kind of asks two questions that aren't answerable. What are those two questions that you think that Harvey's answer asks?
What do we really know about like the structure of internal contradictions within the capitalist mode of production? Also, when does a contradiction become a quote unquote absolute contradiction and generate a crisis?
Right. So he has this innovation where there's absolute and relative, I guess, or absolute contradictions and just regular old contradictions, which is a very weird way to talk about it. But, and the absolute contradictions when like the unresolved crisis becomes really unresolvable and the business cycle kicks back in. Okay, that's cool. I don't think that's an economic theory. That's like a meta narrative about economics. Then we hit Kleiman's response. Kleiman had been in a backdoor war with Paul Sweezy fans for, I don't know, 2 decades. And he wrote a book called, Getting Rid of the Whole Transformation Theory Problem. I'm not going to do this today because that debate is a Marxiological debate that takes hours to fully understand. But he then writes a second book, which is what I knew him for, actually, called The Failure of Capitalist Production, The Underlying Causes of the Great Recession. And you and I both read this book, and I read it in 2010. So about 2 years after he wrote it. I interviewed him about it in person in South Korea in 2011. I was convinced by parts of it because there are some things he points out that were normally dropped from left-wing economic discussions in this time. So let's talk about what his thesis is.
I don't know that it's particularly unique, although it might be useful, which is, the 2008-2009 financial crisis results from the fall in the rate of profit. The thing is that how is this different from like every other crisis in the history of capitalism? Right.
Which he basically doesn't answer. Why is this housing thing where it's triggering it not normal? I mean, because I think what people don't realize is the housing market being the trigger for a recession is it starts in Japan in 2001. And then it hits kind of everywhere but China in 2008, 2006, 2007, 2008. But that's not actually historically normal at all. Usually the housing market collapsing is the result of a recession, not the cause of it. So, so that's interesting. He also like Kleiman insists that the rate of profit of corporations in the United States has never recovered from the neoliberal revival period of the early 1980s. But he also thinks that neoliberalism isn't really what decimated the U.S. working class. That was actually the decline in rates of profits, and that he says a lot. Another thing that he was actually aiming at was people like Elizabeth Warren, who was talking about income disparity. You'll notice that in post 2012, a lot of the Keynesian left moved from talking about income disparity to talking about wealth disparity.
Yeah.
Which is interesting to me because that should have been an obvious difference even back then. And one of the things that Kleiman points out was the increased cost of benefits, medical benefits in particular, not being factored into what people think was the profitability crisis. So he's like saying, if you look at overall compensation and not just income, you will see that there's a profitability crisis. Now, people forget that during this time period that, again, we were talking about all these anti-consumerists a little while ago, and the reason why I mentioned that is because who's Kleiman arguing with is Naomi Klein and Elizabeth Warren, who's saying this is all greed.
All right.
Like, Kleiman's saying, no, this is capitalism. Now, if for those of you who are used to classical Marxist economists like Heinrich Grossman, and this sounds very similar, it is. The difference is that Grossman believes in a final crisis and Kleiman believes that there is no final crisis of capitalism, that this can happen over and over again forever.
Well, the difference also is that people are, at least in some measure, paying attention to this much more again than they were.
Oh, yeah, that's a fundamental difference. No, like, I was a weirdo for following economics and becoming a leftist in 2007, 2008. Like, it was like, and it's funny because I talk to people about that, and I'm like, no, but literally, I felt like I was the only person. Everybody else was solely invested in the anti-war movement. I was also invested in the anti-war movement, but I was noticing that shit that they were saying in the anti-war movement could not be true. For example, that like the whole thing was about blood for direct oil extraction. And I'm like,
yeah,
that's not true. It's absolutely not true. So I mean, people forget. I think there's a lot of convenient forgetting of how wrong the left was.
Yeah, especially on Iraq. Yeah. The multinational oil companies prefer orderly legal arrangements between nation states, not war.
I was about to say, like, did people forget that during the Iraq War, oil went up to the most expensive it's ever been until now? Like, until literally right now? Like, adjusted for inflation until literally this week.
So yeah, these things going on with climate and Harvey are interesting.
They are interesting, but they are bigger than Marxist views of the economy have ever been. But as we're both seeing, there's parts about them that are dissatisfactory. Another part that you don't mention, in your notes to me, but I had noticed is Kleiman only looks at the U.S., but it's a worldwide financial crisis, right?
Yeah.
So you have issues, and he'll admit that like profitability rates and stuff are different in different areas, but he doesn't have a theory that he puts out in a public paper that I know of about his reasons for saying he focused only on U.S. numbers was just that he trusted U.S. numbers because he trusts the accounting of the Bureau of statistics. And then he would say to me, like he said to me in person when I asked him about this on a worldwide basis, he's like, there are similar trends, but there are all kinds of things that complicate this. So I'm looking at the core of capital, which is the United States, and we can deduce stuff from there, and then other general trends will more or less follow suit. Then we need to talk about Keynesianism and quantitative easing. And one of the funny things that I find interesting right now on, say, modern monetarist theory is how many of them hate quantitative easing and how many of them want to defend it. It's actually a split in that kind of post-Keynesian milieu. But let's talk about this. So, Keynes, General Thesis of Money. What does that do?
Well, I guess the reason I raise this is because there actually seems to be a bit of a turn within Keynesianism in the middle of the Great Depression that has some bearing upon the issue of whether or not quantitative easing could be considered Keynesian. And correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but it's to my understanding that during the early stages of the Great Depression around 1930, so Keynes he published his first book on the Treatise of Money, in which he recognized that essentially growth would not restart, is the whole crux of the issue, and everyone's kind of grabbing at how to get it restarted again, and Keynes is maintaining that it's going to take something very different than classical economics that it had insisted would be necessary. And so he says in the Treatise of Money, central banks would have to intervene with unconventional monetary policies that were designed to lower the cost of borrowing and raise sufficient liquidity for investment. In other words, just trying to get the official interest rate down would not be enough. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, Keynes advocated buying government bonds and boosting fiat money quantity rather than just trying to lower the price of short-term money, and that would be effective at spurring growth. And the reason that it would be effective at spurring growth is because the increase in liquidity in the banking system would also raise confidence by convincing investors that the low cost of borrowing was here to stay. And that's kind of prefaced by, as far as I understand, Michael Woodard and MMT, of which Ben Bernanke was apparently a fan.
Yeah, so early MMT was not called MMT, and what actually the neo-chartalist MMT hybrid theory that we kind of have in the 2010s, if we think back, because I was interviewing Stephen Keen and stuff in 2012, 2013, 2014 myself on these issues when I was educating myself about what the left economic theories were. Minsky was kind of the bridge figure, and then Woodward is another one, and that picks up with people becoming interesting in Knapp and Michelle Ennis to come up with an endogenous theory of money, because basically Keynes has a general theory of money, but Keynes actually is kind of iffy about whether or not it's private or private, how much of a role private money creation plays in
right.
everything. He's a little iffy on it. And he actually does think, for example, that inflation's a problem. How you handle inflation is actually similar to what MMTers say you would do, but why Keynes says it is different. Keynes says, well, the government has to pay for stuff, so eventually when times are better, you raise taxes, it slows down the inflation rate, and the government can lower its debt ratios. MMT basically says, well, there's no need for them to lower their debt ratios. It's all endogenous to the state. That's the difference, but it's effectively almost the same thing. The difference is how you explain what's happening. Then you have his more interesting and more problematic Keynes' general theory of employment, interest, and money in 1936. So let's talk about that, because I think people miss that the general thesis, the thesis on money and the general theory of employment, interest, and money actually say different things. So.
Yeah, they do. So if the original belief was that QE could get a capitalist economy out of a slump by pumping banks and companies with cash, or by keeping bond interest rates apparently low, permanently low. Is this wrong? Well, at least judging by Keynes's perspective in the general theory of employment, interest, and money, he says that we didn't take the state of confidence into account. He says that the state of confidence, its influence on the schedule of the marginal efficiency of capital. He said they're not two separate factors affecting the rate of investment, namely the schedule of marginal efficiency of capital and the state of confidence. The state of confidence is relevant because it is one of the major factors in determining the former. So therefore, like, there is no clear evidence, and this is Keynes, there's no clear evidence from experience that the investment policy which is socially advantageous coincides with that which is most profitable. So I guess, you know, his break here is that, like, low interest rates and extra liquidity can't get things going again if the profitability of an investment, or what Keynes calls the marginal efficiency of capital, remains too low.
Yeah, so Keynes is basically granting something that's interesting. So basically, I want people to realize how profound this is, because the thesis of money is, you know, where MMT, heterodox post-Keynesian economics, all that stuff. Steve Keen, so he's not an MMT, but very close. Minsky, all that comes out of that. A lot of it does take the general theory of employment, interest, and money into account, but I found it really interesting, for example, when I was arguing with my MMT friend about him saying that QE was just an open market operator, and I was like, well, even if it functions by open market operations, it does some different things, and buying corporate bonds is one of them. But the other things that it does is that it is that they always, when I talk about the QE effect, I'm like, it's a subjective thing that's predictable. And what thing is, Keynes's later work is all about that. But they seem to want to bracket out anything that's subjectively predictable as like, well, it's not going to always happen that way. It could happen another way.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm like, it's predictable. Like, no, I'm not saying that it's going to happen the exact same way every single time, but there'd have to be another set of incentives at play for it not to, in aggregate, follow the same pattern. And you haven't shown me what those other incentives were.
Right. They might have been able to if they had instituted QE in the 80s, but they didn't.
Right. So Keynes starts thinking that maybe, you know, these subjective factors in conjunction with the profitability or the rate of return on investments would indicate that maybe you couldn't do QE forever. Like, because of, you know, this is where the animal spirit stuff comes in Keynes' talk, which is wild, but it is more explainable. So low interest rates and extra liquidity cannot get things going again if the profitability of investment remains low, which as a Marxist, I've always been like, you are saying we're not wrong. Like, I know, because one of the things I think people miss is Shaktism is a, you know, in Nazi Germany, Hilferding, monopoly capital theory. There was a deep wish to find a left-wing economics that was not Marxist. Now, I don't want to say, I don't have like a lot of views like are the aforementioned maybe Andrew Kleinman, who think a lot of this was like an active conspiracy to undermine Marxist economics or something. I don't think I've ever said that directly, but he sure as hell has implied it. I don't believe that, but there was a strong sense from like what, you know, people might call the left wing of capital, a phrase that's been ruined now.
Right.
But there's a long sense in which they wanted a non-Marxist theory of money, because also I think people forget this. A whole lot of like basic Marxism was not even readily available to anybody in translation yet in the English-speaking world, or a lot of it wasn't even released in Germany till like the early 20th century. So in some ways, some of the questions of Marxism, we didn't even have the answers for in Marx. Like, so this leads us to another problem, though. If we take this statement in the general theory of interest, employment, employment, interest, and money. I hate the fucking title. I always wish capital's like a better title, guy. This leads to helicopter money, right? So what do we mean by that?
Well, I thought it interesting that Keynes had considered this question because that is most definitely what we got in 2020.
Right.
The question is whether it boosts demand and thus growth. And at least Keynes's answer was not if it's saved or applied to existing debt. And
right.
We've
also
already
what happened with the stimulus.
Which is what we've already established happened to a lot of the stimulus on both like an individual and like a corporate business level.
Right. So the whole Keynesian multiplier effect actually doesn't work with direct injections of funds.
Yeah.
So I mean, Keynes literally thinks you have to target stuff. You have to. That's where infrastructure investment and all that becomes a crucial part of Keynes.
Yeah, because it comes down to the question of when you do QE and you increase the M2 money supply that way, does the quantitative easing wind up in the right sectors of the economy? And at least
the answer is clearly no.
Well, yeah. At least there's I'll at least say this: there's a pretty sizable body of evidence that suggests that the answer might be no.
I was about to say, during QE, inequality in the United States went up dramatically. It's been going up during the entire neoliberal period, but during the QE period, which is arguably not, I actually think QE is the sign of the end of neoliberalism myself. I know that's the minority view, but inequality rates in the U.S. Let's look this up.
I mean, we already know that the way that the service industry has dealt with the labor shortage is not by increasing wages, but rather automation. As of right now, and this is like a month ago, the restaurant industry is now they have simply adapted to doing with 10% less labor force than they did prior to COVID. So that's one way in which we know that it doesn't wind up in the right sector.
Yeah, we know that. We know that inequality has. Here we go. Now I found it. I'm like, where's my chart? So no, a lot of them conveniently stop actually at 2009. That's funny. Because ironically, when people start talking about it, is actually when it gets worse. Yes, this kind of goes into this. So I'm going to share this with everybody right now. This is from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. But let me find this chart here. Income gains in the top 1%. They were bad going up, in the 90s. They were not great. You saw a massive increase in the 80s too, but big increases in the 90s. Then you see a super steep increase in the Bush administration, then a falling to 2010, then a rebound, which gets us back to early aughts levels. And then if you look at raw numbers, it gets ridiculous. All right. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that if the goal of QE was to return profitability to the entirety of the economy in an equal sense, okay, let's not assume that they're being worker forward, just that everybody benefits on relatively the same rates. We have objective evidence that is not true, that the rich disproportionately benefited from these policies. And the other thing that I think we saw is we saw underinvestment in traditional commodity forms, even in the stock market.
Repeat the second thing you just said.
So underinvestment in traditional commodity forms, even in the stock market. So something like food, which has inelastic demand, safe. People aren't investing in, because while it's safe, it has very low returns that barely are going to probably either just keep at or barely beat inflation. Well, that means, by the way, that all this production infrastructure doesn't have investment money or U.S. direct investment going into it. and except through like government contracts and shit. That's it. So that's not great. And I don't think people realize what this means. So let's talk about this for a second. During this time period, around 2012, Piketty, who's a Keynesian economist who has clearly never read Capital, writes a book called Capital. Actually, what is it called? It's Capital in the 20th in the 21st century. And Piketty does change a lot of things around these prior like ways of viewing things. So one of the things Piketty does is he floats shit that would, I don't know how it's even possible, but like a global wealth tax, and stuff like that. But he starts talking about inequality, and he also stops the left from focusing on income and starts them focusing on actual wealth accumulation, and the history of that. So you have that shift in Keynesian focus, but there's not really, I mean, he's still basically a left Keynesian. Then after Piketty, you have, and people trying, particularly because of the financial crisis in the EU. Well, the EU, by legal reasons, does not have currency sovereignty. It has a peg currency forever and ever, amen, because of the EU constitution, if you're in the Eurozone. Now, that's not true for the UK, but it is true for the EU. So then you see a lot of Minsky and Steve Keen and a lot of these heterodox left Keynesians who do not incorporate monetary policy into it start also working on neo-chartalist theory, or the endogenous theory of money. And they start floating this idea that like Greece could go independent from the euro and could just be okay because it can print its own drachma and inflate itself out of its debt crisis.
Yeah.
And people would just accept that, even though we literally saw that Argentina could not do that just a few years prior. And everyone says it's because they pegged their current. All the MMTers would say it's because they pegged their currency to the dollar, without talking about why they pegged their currency to the dollar, which is they have to buy shit, and you need a foreign currency to do that. And the biggest thing they have to buy is oil, and that's going to be traded in USD or pegged to USD at all times. But just in general, you have to have some kind of reserve currency. It doesn't have to be USD. It can also be euros. It can be British pounds. It can even, and increasingly can be even be yuan, but it's got to be something other than your national currency, because if people can't use, if you are not providing goods that people can pay with that currency, and people don't have to pay you taxes in your currency, you can't command shit. So there you go. But that's when it really starts to become popular, because people start really putting hopes on people like Yanis Varoufakis. A name is still important, even though his strategy and Syriza objectively failed and was never taken up anyway.
Right.
But let's talk about QE and modern monetary theory. Modern monetary theory kind of comes from two different things colliding together, and kind of three different things now. So initially, it's endogenous theory of money from chartalism, and then neo-chartalism after the historian Michelle Innes talks about the endogenous creation of money as opposed to barter money. All this is like economic scholastic debates. Doesn't initially seem to make a whole lot of major points, but it's like the anti-gold bug theory. So the theory here is basically debts and credits are really what money comes out of, not from barter. You see this in David Graeber's debt book, which comes really popular around Occupy. It's like a #1 bestseller. You see the work of Michael Hudson and his idea of super imperialism that he floated in the 70s become dominant again on the left. That's also concurrent to that. But then you have all these people who used to be Keynesians start picking up modern monetary theory. So in modern monetary theory, money does not come from civil society. It comes from either the state, or this is actually a fine distinction, but it is one. It's a debate within modern monetary theorists, are from law. All right. And we can get into why that's a debate later, but this is just something to know. Marxism and MMT, aside from a few people like Fozzie and Bill Mitchell, who are really kind of nationalists, are at odds. One, because MMT seems to just totally reject labor theory of value. Two, because Marx's answer to whether or not money comes from the civil society of the state is actually really complicated. Would you like to talk about that? So yeah, we have an internet problem. So Marx's theory on whether or not monetary theory money comes from the state or from civil society is actually complicated. Marx made the argument against the quantity of money theorists during the banking crisis of the 1840s. So what is he saying? He's a prohibitory. Any monetary economy must provide the possibility of hoarding, taking money out of circulation to preserve its value. In a slump or a crash, capitalists will try to hoard and avoid reinvestment because reinvestment will not be profitable. So you see incomes increase, but investments decrease during a slump, according to Marx. If profitability stays low, then a low rate of interest or mountains of liquidity will not release the hoard of money being trapped up at the above. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink because they're not going to feel like there's going to be enough profit on returns to actually lead to reinvestment. So this is similar to like the liquidity trap with Keynes, actually. So this is again where Marx and Keynes aren't totally at odds. Eventually, though, in Marx, this will break down. Like you'll start having overproduction of stocks, which will not of stocks of goods, which will no longer really serve as commodities. Someone's got to do something with that. Everyone's hoarding their wealth and they don't want to reinvest. So you just have these things sitting around and there's less and less production. And then prices will start to drop. You'll have deflationary pressures, and then you'll have a deflationary crisis. So Marx made similar arguments to Keynes, actually, against the quantity of money theorists during the banking crisis of the 1840s. Okay. Now, one thing that I will say, Marx doesn't comment much on inflation and deflation because, well, for reasons that are complicated. One theory is that he lives in a time because of gold where money is very stable. Another theory is that it's actually kind of already baked in to some of his comments on this hoarding crisis. Anyway, is there sufficient evidence that QE programs led to an increase in credit?
Yeah, I don't know what the Fed economists think, but I know what the European economists think.
Yeah. So what do the European economists say? The Fed economists are in disagreement with themselves on this. So
yeah. So they think that QE significantly reduced bank risk and allowed banks access to market-based financing again. They also think that the increase in bank health translated to an increased loan supply for like the corporate sector, especially to low-quality borrowers.
So what does that mean? Low-quality borrower. We'll finish the quote, then we'll talk about what it means.
Yeah, and then these firms use the cash inflow from new bank loans to build up cash reserves, but show no significant increase in real activity. That is, no increase in employment or investment.
So yeah, they build up cash reserves. They do shit like stock buybacks, right? Like that was the big thing that finally got being talked about around 2016.
Yeah, it was the bonus scandal and the stock buyback programs that really got people going during the financial crisis.
Right. So non-Keynesian fiscal spending was a thing. Okay.
Yeah, and the rest of the stuff from here is just kind of odds and ends. Yeah, in my notes, so it's not even like pointed or organized. Just kind of things that I had noticed here and there for various reasons.
So yeah, we're going to talk about them, and then and we can kind of wrap this up, because I think I don't want people to think we have an answer to all these questions, because I don't. But what we're seeing right now is basically I'm a Marxist. I actually do think that there's a general tendency of the rate of profits to fall for a variety of reasons, not just the one Marx stated in Capital and Capital Volume 2. And I don't believe that because it's ideologically a requirement. I believe it because I felt like I saw it happening in rates of returns and in GDP before I became a Marxist. I'm like, GDP's been dropping forever. Like,
yeah, certainly it showed up in areas like that, but I think that one of the most revealing is the fact that like we appear to be addicted to QE. Like, there was the taper tantrum in I forget what year it was. I think around 2015, when the markets really freaked out when the Fed was about to start offloading its balance sheet and to begin financial. It was 2013 when it planned to start offloading its balance sheet and to raise rates. And so for pretty much the entire time, for like the last 17 years, the federal funds like interbank loan rate has been, by all historical standards, artificially low, as well as the fact that for like since the past 13 years, people forget this is the longest bull market in history, and it has been on QE the entire time. It's been jacked up on it, and so one of the big beefs that the left had with capitalism at the time of the Great Recession is that banks did increasingly rely on speculative activity to generate profit, and then of course roped a lot of other corporations within other sectors of the economy into it through complex financial derivatives. However, I guess I would also challenge and say that part of the whole like anti-consumerist narrative in that first decade of the 2000s, also came, I feel like, from an inability to recognize a boom, even if we were in one. And so, it does beg the question, it should be further specified whether or not, like the roughly 2015 to 2020 period should be considered a legitimate boom or not.
Right. And what was interesting that, like, I remember during the Trump administration, everyone's like, well, you can predict if someone thinks it's a boom based on their politics, not on their relation to the economy. And the same is probably true in the beginning of the Biden administration. It's definitely not true now, though. This is not the kind of slump that you can partisanly lie yourself out of.
Yeah, and just due to the extent to which this has been performed in contrast to times past, then it's just really logical to assume that the implications of this unwinding of the Fed's positions is going to have so much more of a drastically more a greater impact on the overall global economy and not just the United States economy than it did in 2008 and 2009.
Right. Well, because China's now in a business cycle, like, which,
yeah, there's that too.
I mean, and also China's having its own. It's having the problems that Japan had in 2001, China's having in 2020 and 21.
Yeah, in the early 2000s, the concern was amongst a lot of like Western political scientists and economists is that the Chinese economy was expanding at a rate at which the Chinese like authoritarian political structure could not accommodate to, and that there would be a tension between that, which would ultimately be disadvantageous towards the CCP. And then now all of a sudden we're thrown back into the opposite dynamics.
Right. I want to talk to you a little bit though about the longue durée of Keynesianism, because there is a way in which a lot of leftists, and this is something that I think is not just amongst far leftists, really hanker for the heyday of Keynesianism.
They really do. They really do. And I guess like the thing to zero in on there is that, like, you know,
even though the New Deal didn't actually, one thing I actually point out to people is the New Deal actually didn't actually operate on Keynesian lines. So,
well, not only that, but it's arguable whether or not the New Deal is what brought us out of, you know, the Great Depression. Anyway,
I think it's arguable to the point that I don't know anybody who will say it brought us out of it. Some people will say it made it not worse.
Yeah,
I don't know. I think it's pretty clear that World War II.
It took the expansion of production and the debts accrued from governments borrowing to expand production for World War II to bring us out of the recession. That much is agreed on. But you know, the crisis of Keynesianism in the late 60s to the early 1970s was, you know, to fall back, you know, to circle back here to Kliman, was a crisis in the general rate of profitability of the reinvestment of capital. And you know, it's certainly not a unique observation of Kliman's. I mean,
Kliman's actually not different from most economic historians I know who talk about financialization, not as a result of the crisis of profitability in the 70s. Like, I heard that like on like NPR. Like, that's not I think even super. It's debated amongst politicians, but it's not debated amongst most economists. Although now it kind of is, because there was a tendency at the end of the Obama administration going into this kind of new Keynesianism. So I'm going to talk about this. Basically, classical Keynesianism ends in the 1970s. It is maintained.
Yeah. Should we remark briefly on how thoroughly Keynesianism had come to dominate America, not just American politics, but people need to know this too, is that Keynesianism, the New Deal wasn't simply an American phenomenon. Because of course, during the decolonization of like former European colonies in that post-war moment, it was held up as a potential path for development for newly decolonized, you know, former European states, and it was held up against, you know, the Soviet model for for global development, and so was exported in that way. And so in that way, a lot of the developing world's mentality reflects like the thinking of the American Democratic Party in like the mid 20th century, and in many ways still lingers in that way. But also just domestically, Keynesianism and like New Dealism had come to so thoroughly dominate American politics that, you know, Nixon considered himself a Keynesian. It was like pulling teeth in the 1930s to get people to think neoclassical economics wouldn't work. But once that transformation was complete, you know, after the 1940s, people were more or less on board across the American political spectrum.
Yeah, I think like people forget about like the post-war consensus. Paul Maddock writes about this, the new Keynesian internationalism, development of the Keynesian developmental state. It had an influence on Peronism, which Naomi Klein used to have a hankering for.
Yeah.
But what I find fascinating is there was a revisionist history coming out of the neo-Keynesians in the mid-teens that claimed that the stagflation was a policy mistake, and it was almost solely from the OPEC oil debacle, and that a stagflation wouldn't have happened otherwise. And what I find hard to believe about that is if you actually look at when stagflation starts to show up in the late 60s, it is before the oil crisis.
Yeah.
So
Well, it certainly shows up in the stock market by 67. It stays flat for about 13 years.
Right. Like, and so I don't believe that it was just a policy mistake. Now the war plays into that. The fact that people thought that war could stimulate the God, I remember people debating this up to the Gulf War, like, because I'm old enough to remember this. Like, war is always good for the economy. I'm like, only when you don't get bombed and don't have to like invest in some other country's infrastructure directly, who doesn't have capital otherwise. So yeah. But Keynesian stuff completely falls away by the end of the 70s. And I think people think, because of David Harvey, that neoliberalism, was cracked at Mount Perrin society, given whole cloth by Von Hayek and co. and the Chicago Boys in a nice little book directly to Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and then implemented as a political program from on high. The truth of the matter is, all the conditions that begin neoliberalism start before either Thatcher or Reagan come to power. In response to the profitability crisis, they just get more aggressive in how they implement them and codify them into the American society. So in the period of labor's rule in the 70s, they try to get the unions on board with neoliberalization, as opposed to telling them to fuck themselves.
And later on, finally did, at least in the case of Europe. I know in Germany, where like labor unions in Europe are more like thoroughly like integrated into like state like co-management positions. They wanted those jobs to be automated because they wanted like their work. The auto industry wanted to be high, like more highly skilled in that way.
Right. So most mainstream economists says old Keynesianism died. Then there was a new Keynesianism that emerged that I was talking about in the 1990s. That basically like, we're Keynesians, but we agree with monetarism, which is a big shift. That's like early Krugman, that's Larry Summers, that's the Clinton advisement team. That's the early Obama advisement team. And then towards the end of the aughts, there began to be focus on something called heterodox economics or heterodox post-Keynesianism. And that is where you see a revival of Keynesianism, but it's revived off of the line of the treatise, and it's about endogenous money theories and the basically, I think, pretending, frankly, that most economies have autarkic self-organization, and what they start justifying these monetary theories off of specific periods in U.S. colonial government, British colonial government, particularly in Africa. They love to talk about. Randall Ray loves to bring up Cecil Rhodes, and they kind of take this imperial policy and colonial policy as a default truth based off of the work of the post-Marxist German thinker Knapp, who was highly influenced by Ferdinand Lassalle.
This is happening, but I think interesting to observe is what happened to like any kind of post-capitalist discourse during that time. Like you get like these sort of like neo-Keynesian like political projects that are solidified. So what I always found really fascinating is Marxism is used as the David Harvey style Marxism is used to justify Keynesian promoting a Keynesian policy that never comes to pass. And initially, what you find interesting is some of these new monetarist friendly late Keynesians like Krugman jump on board with that. And then you have people like I'm going to name names here, Doug Henwood, who sometimes claims to be a Marxist and sometimes is just Keynesian. Right.
Like,
well, yeah, and then you just get like the whole notion, we're thrown back again on like the left wing of capital. And this is going to be a bit of a controversial point for some people, but I just don't know at this point that like the Democrats are the left wing of capital.
No, if anything,
it's
they're
not
the
at all
ones
self-evident.
overseeing austerity right now.
Right.
Like, because they can't get any of their stimulus stuff through, they can't maintain their own, and they don't have any interest in it. They're even pivoting on running on things like we're balancing the budget again, which, by the way, when the Democrats balance the budget, they brag about it, but it usually means we're about to be in recession. Which is something like that. I will say something that the MMTers have noticed and commented about all the way back to Michael Hudson, like who's not an MMT, or kind of proto MMT, but still. And Michael Woodward. I mean, they have noticed these things, but we have to talk about the difference between now and 2008 and why people should be really fucking concerned. China is in a totally different place than it was in 2008. Like, its GDP is much lower. And it's interesting to me because a lot of the left, unquote, really seems to believe that China is in the position to bail us all, the entire world out, when there's no evidence for that at all. And it may be a little bit did, actually. It's part of what I think did happen in 2009. Also, if we don't have QE anymore, and we can't imagine a world run with it because it might lead to massive inflation, at least
then what is this going to be? And this is really the crux of the issue, because I was Danny Jacobs recently pointed me towards an article the other day. It was like Taiwan scrambles 26 jets or something. And what it reminded me of is that, really what's being tested here is the interdependence of the world. And all that's happening is just people are just scrambling about how the new independence will be constituted. And nobody knows yet. I mean, that is post-neoliberalism.
Yeah. Well, this is something that I actually pick up. I will give Platypus Affiliated Society some credit for this, because as I was beginning to talk about this, I was like, we're not in a neo-Fordist period. We're not in anything. And then Chris Catron did say on an interview on Zero Books that we were looking in the beginning of the Trump administration, something that could probably be called post-neoliberalism. And the only other person I'd seen talk about that was Peter Zeihan. Peter Zeihan, who is an old, he's like, I consider him the anti-Tom Friedman. He's been talking about how globalization was going to collapse, that we were going to be in an age of new nationalism, and that, however, that people who think that multipolar world would just lead to American decline, it does lead to American decline, but it leads to worldwide decline, including decline in China, Russia, etc. And so that in a lot of ways, if you think it's out of the status quo, it is, but it's not leading to like a massive change in the in world power, because everyone's declining. That's what Zeihan's point is. And that this is only going to get worse because one of the backbones of this whole globalized neoliberalism actually has been pumping money into the U.S. military with no abandon to, like, no one even knows that they have a budget.
I mean, that's all certainly possible. I don't know in what kind of position I am to adjudicate that. I just know that, like, so I follow the most bullish analyst on Wall Street. His name is A.V. Gilbert. He's an Elliott waver, which means he follows Elliott wave theory, which I guess is a tool for price prediction, and it's based off of the assumption that a price movement in the market is like a legitimate expression of like mass psychological phenomenon, and that they exhibit patterns which can based upon which patterns are exhibited, you can extrapolate out outcomes. Now, this is the guy that at the bottom of the COVID crash, was calling for the S&P 500 to go to 5,000, and it went to 4,800. And everybody at the time told this guy that he was absolutely nuts. And one of the things that Elliott wave theory takes into account is like these sorts of like these macro super cycles within the economy, and it at least maintains
is actually weirdly copacetic with with something often used by Marxists, which is a Kondrativ wave theory too. So I think Elliott waves actually take waves as actually informative and not noise, but they use it in a different way. Like,
that's
so
interesting. I've not heard of that yet.
So I'm actually looking at like the difference between Elliott wave and Kondrativ cycles or long waves, and then there's apparently Elliott wave people who incorporate them. So,
okay.
And the only other people who incorporate them are like Michael Roberts, the crisis theory guy. Like,
and just like, it's not always just like crisis theory stuff. It's just like people use it as a tool and just like straight up finance too. Right. And so the point is that, this is the guy that at the bottom of the COVID crash was like, drop all your money in, this thing is just going to rocket to 5,000. And then, we only missed it by 200 points, and we still could get there. We could have a dead cat bounce that could send us up to 5,000. We could tag it. And then we're supposed to be entering into at the end of like a macroeconomic super cycle that began sometime in like the early 20th century and has now culminated about a century later, and essentially
Kondrativ waves is where the super cycles come from.
Yeah, and he essentially predicts that, all right, so at the end of like these super cycles, there are market corrections, and that based upon the traits they exhibit, they could go a number of different ways. But typically the one that we're in right now, that there is like a 50% retracement, which means like the stock market loses like 50 to 60% of its value. And that this takes place over the course of several years. And so when the most bullish analyst on Wall Street, who is telling you to like dump all your money in in the middle of massive global lockdowns, is now telling you, I'm the most bullish analyst on Wall Street, and I said that we would get here, but now that we're here, I fear for retirees for the next 20 years, then you should start paying attention.
Yeah, because he's basically saying we're going to be like Japan in the 90s through the
people jumped out of windows when the Nikkei crashed, and like I really hate to talk and think about it in this way, because it really does just represent like a complete and total capitulation to the financialization of the economy and how individual people handle personal finance. But I don't know about you, but I buy index funds. I mean, that's how I plan for retirement.
I was about to say, like, I was trying to save up to buy a house, and I'm just trying to save up some money, and I'm like, even before 2010, I was like, well, I gotta invest this in like at least.
It's too expensive to hold cash. I mean, in the 80s, when you could keep something in a savings account, and it only yielded like 6 or 7%, but you got to think about saving for a house.
6 or 7% versus like 2%, right? So it's outpacing inflation. Whereas now it's like I'm literally losing to inflation in a normal inflationary market of just 2%.
Yeah, and so if this
now I'm like losing massive amounts of money at savings account.
And we're in like such a radically inflationary environment that if the Fed isn't able to get a hold of it, and we've already established that
the Fed's not going to be able to get a hold of it quickly.
Well, the question is, all right, so the big question in finance is whether there is a Fed put on the market. And what that means is that there's a financial vehicle called a put option that you can essentially buy, and it's an option to sell your stock at a certain price if the stock declines below that certain price. So say Apple is at $200 and you bought it at $100, but you were afraid that Apple was going to drop down below 180, and so you buy a put option that says, okay, if this drops below 180, I have the right to sell my shares to somebody for for that price, even though it drops to 160. And the caveat is you have to pay it's like an insurance premium. It may happen, it may not, but you're paying a premium for the right to sell somebody that. And then there's somebody on the other side who says, hey, I don't want to buy something at that price, but I will buy it at a discount. So if it gets to 180, then not only will I will take your 100 shares from you, but you have to pay me to basically be ready to take those. And so the question is whether or not there is a quote unquote Fed put on the market because of quantitative easing. And then that's been the assumption that has been pinning up people's increased risk appetite. And it should be worth noting also that everybody is apparently over leveraged in the market. Like there is a shit ton of borrowing going on, not just individual investors from their brokerages, buying with money that isn't theirs, but like institutions are now over leveraged, hedge funds, pensions, banks, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a question of, if shit goes south quickly, whether quantitative easing is enough to stem market losses from going any further. And so that's been the assumption that everybody has operated on, which has pinned up their risk appetite every time that we've entered into a downturn. And then now that there's no QE, the question is there still a Fed put on the market? How bad could this shit get? What does that mean for inflation, unemployment? What does that mean for postponed?
You have crazy stuff like
this could be bad.
Talking about the need to reshore production, not for jobs for once, actually, but because we just need to be able to produce our own superconductors.
Yeah, exactly.
Our food stocks are up. Because we actually are a good growing country and still are even during climate change, et cetera, and so forth. But that can't happen if we're also trying to weaken labor so that we increase unemployment, which is where like the complication that I add to Marxism. There's a couple of things I add to traditional Marxism, and we're going to talk about the last topic we're going to talk about is like, as much as I am a believer in declining rates of profits, I like you. I'm also like, motherfuckers, your crisis theory, sometimes you're just describing a goddamn business cycle, and sometimes you're not. And I don't even think you know anymore. So, like,
well, there's one thing I do know is that for all of this talk of like Marxist economics since the 2008-2009 financial crisis, a large part of it, you're right, was lent in service of essentially building like a neo-Keynesian political project. And that perhaps one of the reasons why Marxists were so quick to jump in and explain the crisis is because it was like kind of a party trick, in the sense that like they were the smartest people in the room, they felt, and that they could explain the crisis because nobody listened to them prior to that point. When the point is that it really doesn't matter what kind of like assessment, like how accurate of an assessment you have on the economy, because if that were the case, then like, how many capital reading groups do you think have been held, across the world since like the 1970s? Like hundreds, if not thousands, and that hasn't changed.
Well, I mean, I was about to say, and
this is about politics.
Since 2008, there's been millions of capital reading groups across the world.
Exactly, and yet I will point out that perhaps the issue is that like not only are we not in a position to act on whatever economic assessment we might have right now that would be accurate, but we are arguably further away from being able to act than at any other time in the history of the left.
Yeah, this is the important point that I want to point out to you. Since we lended ourselves to a neo-Keynesian campaign, and that Keynesian, and also that basically right now the fight between the Democrats is the fight between Emmentiers and Larry Summers, which means two different types of neo-Keynesians battling it out, right? Like that's what we're actually seeing as left thing. What did Marxists get for that? We got the DSA helping those motherfuckers get elected. Like asshole. And I can't emphasize that enough. I was thinking about this the other day, but and you know what?
It's so
I
sad.
have a lot of friends who are friends with Bhaskar. I have never met Bhaskar. I've come very close to meeting him. Actually, ironically, the closest I came to meeting him was when I was in Platypus Affiliated Society before Jacobin Magazine was really blowing up.
Well, in his defense, you know, that was during that whole like Vivek Chiver like road to power kind of moment too. So you know, even then was a much different discursive moment than we wound up.
Right. I mean, Vivek Chiver and like the people pulling out Mike McNair's early 2001, 2002 book, Revolutionary Strategy.
We appeared to get serious for a minute, and then I don't know what happened, man. I guess Occupy.
Occupy led to Bernie, led
but
to
also
TSA, led to Biden.
I don't know, man. I think you could really just state it even more simply and say that Obama happened, because I mean, how much of like all of the energy like surrounding like a revitalization of the left and a reconsideration of the left was just sucked up by
well, look at Occupy Democrats, which was initially during Obama's early period existed to fuck the Democrats. That's what it existed for. By not even during the Trump administration, by Obama's second term, it became the ultimate meme excuses for whatever the Democrats do, no matter what.
Would also fail to mobilize, like, you know, significant sections of like the American populace. I mean, what was Occupy if not like just like general left activists who are going to be involved, at least to a certain extent, whether or not there's like an economic crisis. But largely, you know, it's students who don't have jobs, and then it's the unemployed. And then like probably people who like work for like Democratic Party adjacent, maybe not like aligned, but Democratic Party adjacent, like
base actually
NGOs and nonprofits.
Exactly. It went from, well, I don't totally believe in the PMC thesis. I've talked about this, but this trend is true. So it's students as the base because they have time, and they do. I mean, and then it's NGO nonprofit people. It's management and urban centers specifically. It's not just management. It's people with graduate degrees who live middle class or upper middle class lifestyles who feel like they can, if they can't contribute money, can at least contribute time. And then it's the very poor. It's what like Clyde Burrow would call the semi-lumpenized. So they're not not the lumpen per se, are the true lumpen, but like people who go in and out of the gig economy, go in and out of the gray economy.
Yeah, undisciplined labor. You know, we're not talking about like
undisciplined labor,
not like drug dealers. We're just talking about like transient labor. And this is all really interesting, Derick, because I don't know, when I ask people, because like my head was half in the sand at this time because I was kind of insulated from the financial crisis, and I actually got like into left politics seriously like a bit later. And when I ask people, you know, like, look at all of this, when I sit back and I read all of this stuff and like how open that moment was discursively, that we recognized that we were in a new century and that we had essentially the death of the 20th century left weighing upon us to like work through, but also that represented like an opportunity. That we maybe didn't have to do like the same old things that like prior generations did. And in fact, prior generations didn't want us to do the same thing that we did and came out and said as such at the time, even though, you know, they may have reneged on it at points. But and they just tell me, people just tell me Obama happened. And so all of the sudden we're cast into this moment where like the Marx is gone from my perspective. I mean, like anything having to do with like the actual mark of all of this, like what point does it really have actually? Because there's nothing to be a Marxist about. Like what point is there to calling oneself a Marxist today? There is no object upon which the Marxists to act.
Well, I was about to say, usually you're actually signaling some weird geopolitical commitment is what you're actually signaling. You're not signaling an economic theory. You're not even signaling a political theory anymore, because it's not one or two. Like I have been making the point for 5 years now. There's someone calls themselves a Marxist. I don't know. I mean, are Marxist Leninist, or a Leninist, or some variety of Marxist? I actually cannot, even from the sub-specialization, predict what they're going to believe on anything. So,
and that's how you get like weird people like the Socialist Workers Party, who are like ostensibly Trotskyists, but they're also like into like defending Cuba because Cuba's like the least bad example of like actually existing socialism or something. It's like, where did Cuba come from?
Do the same thing, actually.
Yeah.
And it's like, so if these labels are non-predictive, if I cannot predict what a person's political line is going to be on war, but war is actually interesting because that should be that's the area where there probably is the most legitimate Marxist variability, historically speaking. But I can't predict what someone's going to believe in economics. I like, people will say, well, you know, there's Marxist underconsumptionist and overconsumptionist theory. I'm like, yeah, but none of y'all believe in the underconsumptionist Rosa Luxemburg version of breakdown either. You believe in Keynesianism or modern monetary theory or some hybrid thereof. You will also say that Marx believed things he didn't believe. For example, like the idea that Marx only believed in commodity money that existed through barter. That's not true. The Grundrisse makes it pretty clear that that's not true.
I think the reason that you're getting this, at least in part, I think, is like, if we think of like education or learning as like the transference of like generational experience, then really what we're actually doing is lacking a lot of that here. There was an attempt to make one between like, you know, boomers and
yeah,
Gen
basically
X.
Basically the Klimans, the Huddises, the Leo Paniches, and the David Harveys of the world, they tried to skip Gen X and go directly to the millennials during Occupy and be like, we have the Marxism, you may have it. And the millennials was like, we like the name, let's move the Overton window.
Well, I think certainly what wound up, I think one of the biggest losses of that moment, and the way in which you know that the quote unquote millennial left and its associated project failed, is because if education and learning is like an intergenerational transference of like, you know, learned or like lived experience, then certainly what millennials failed to impart on Zoomers is the notion of like society at large. And you know, I don't know exactly what, like, you know, Zoomer leftists believe now, partly for the reason that you alluded to, like the autodidacticism, because you're not seeing nearly as much of like of an education being
that's why you beat all these people
institutionally. Like on the sectarian left is not really giving anybody like a thorough education anymore, along with its drying up of activity. And so you get this eclecticism. And then by and large, I think that what millennials, especially millennial leftists, would have wanted Zoomers to take away from the great financial crisis is the fact that we do live in a society and that we all live in like a globally like.
The problem is though,
and it's not just like globalization. I mean, like we live in a project that we have all agreed to participate in, and that's like a singular project. And I don't think that they think that like society as such exists. I think that there's just like nation states, and like that's it, and that they interact. But sometimes there's conflict, and that's all.
Well, this has been a problem, and you actually see that reflected in left economic theory. What was methodological nationalism, which is why I brought it up with Kleiman, has become just nationalism, both left and right. And people pretending, and I see this amongst national conservatives as well, that economies are autarkic, and they're fundamentally fucking not. Even if we're moving to this post-globalized, renationalized world, which I think we kind of are. Like it's still like you can't get your whole electrification of the economy, Green New Deal thing. If you can't get cobalt from fucking Congo, you can't do it.
Yeah, did you read the Post-American World at the time?
Yeah, I did
read Zachariah. I feel like we got like the Post-American World, but like on opiates.
Yeah. Yeah,
We got that book, but like on Roxy's, like, and we feel dirty.
So you have these Marxists who are like self-educated and are literally repeating talking points. I'm not again name names. Donny Hoffong, affiliated with the Black Agenda Report, saying shit like multipolarity is a proletarian struggle, and I'm like, multipolarity is just a description. It's not even a description of a thing you want to build. It's a description of the fact of having multiple major powers with multiple captured economic zones in competition with each other, with small states having incentives to side with different ones of those to, and also for, if you actually read British psychology, so I have people selling this, which is Fareed Zakaria as warmed over by coffee house post-fascist Alexander Dugin, who lost his position at Moscow University, being sold back to us as leftism because people think that Stalinism, and I'm calling it Stalinism advisedly, because I don't even think it's Marxist-Leninism. I think it's an aesthetic attachment, because most of the people do not actually know what they believe. Like, they do not, for example, realize that there are tensions between the clans of Xi, Deng, and Mao. That they aren't, that actually, that there have to be completely different things, and they're not like clear developments of one each other either. So, or they don't realize that, like,
just understanding the dynamics, accurately understanding the dynamics of the Democratic Party. I mean, you have to go outside of your own country. And so what this really boils down to, Derick, I think it is, this is a common thread through like the entire new century. It's just the failure on behalf of like any left-leaning political project to successfully expand the electoral franchise. You have the failure, during Obama, I don't think that anybody in the Democratic Party really wanted to expand the electoral franchise, because they saw what was going on with like the Tea Partiers and how disruptive that was. Right. And so there was it's the neoliberal consensus. And so, there was a failure to address that through like the neo-social democracy of like the Sanders campaign as it made its turn rightward. After 2016, initially there was a lot of hope.
People are fundamental in denial about that too. That there's a rightward trajectory in Sanders.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, they fucked up. I mean, like if you just look at the long arc of politics from like the mid 20th century until now, there is a straight line from away from mass politics and towards identity politics, and so the elements of that, which was sort of borrowed, or at least paid lip service to by the Bernie campaign for the purpose of bringing on sections of the Democratic Party which had formerly like been like lukewarm or distrustful towards it, for example blacks in the South, came at a cost, which is that they went too hard on leveraging the Democratic Party's like existing electorate composition, and did very little of what the great promise was from the first campaign, which was the extension or the crossover into like what was being sucked up by Trumpism.
Right.
The idea. Yeah, the biggest party in this country is still people who don't vote, and we haven't done shit to really appeal to those people, and we actually continue to actively drive them away.
I was about to say, and it's not. People are talking about the Republicans' assault on democracy, and they're not totally wrong on that. But they're also like not looking at the fact that Democrats don't really give a shit except to motivate their national base. They are not doing things that you would need to do to counteract this on a state level.
Voting rights is a fucking sham.
So in this fundamental thing, you have a Democratic Party that I given the way they're acting this year, I don't know that I think they want to win. And my mild conspiracy theory is like they actually, that safe Democratic senators actually benefit in donations during opposition years. And so you have all these like really destructive counter political tendencies. You have a left that says it's one thing but doesn't know what that thing is, and it's mostly like I've been talking about this for a long time. I've now said it on 3 different shows recently, not just my own. That if you want to think about the rebirth of Marxist-Leninism as a joke form on Twitter, amongst Zoomer leftists, what you really need to look at is the fact that Trotsky has failed to have a compelling narrative about why they still needed to exist after the fall of the Soviet Union, to be frank. And then the Social Democrats failed to have a narrative about how they were going to be any fucking different than the progressive wing of the Democrats in the aughts or the 90s.
Yeah, a convincing one.
They weren't. And now, despite the fact that I was told by many people on the left that the Biden win was a proof that we were going to be able to move the Democratic Party leftward, that Bernie's key position in his committee placement as I think was it the budget chair?
Oh yeah, so he can oversee the finances of the ruling class and do nothing about it because he knows that anything that he does and he's gone.
Right. And so I'm like, I heard all this, and then the rhetoric out of the White House for the first 6 months was closer than under the Obama administration to what the neo-Keynesians wanted.
Well, it is pro-union. I can say that. But the labor is not the left.
Right. And the other thing that I've been dealing with lately, I would love labor to go back to being the left. This is, I agree with you that labor is not the left, but if there is a future for the left, it is the re-merger of the left and labor. I think that is a fundamental Marxist truth. Like the left is, when the left is decoupled from labor, both sides get screwed. Not that we necessarily did a historically good job of it, either labor or the left, during our last merger period, to be honest, but are around in there. That is an upper end estimate. You cannot build an electorate off that. And the voting patterns of the Latin community, of the Asian community, of specifically the South Asian community, do not fit those voting patterns and never have. The only time they were loyal to the Democrats was during this time period that we were talking about, when the Republicans were so discredited in 2006 that pretty much all major demographic groups started to abandon them, except for uneducated white voters. And the working class is not actually, is the class least likely to vote. So when people talk about the political beliefs of the working class and the left, I'm like, it's awfully convenient they don't vote in large enough numbers that you can basically say they believe whatever because no one's really keeping track of it because they don't vote. So,
did you check anything on the labor? And this might be an interesting note to wrap things up on. Did you catch anything on the Labor Notes conference?
Yeah, I literally just did.
I
literally did a kind of, my IWW friends did a kind of excited debrief about that. But what did you take away from Labor Notes this weekend?
Well, I read the who was it? Who are the Northites, World Socialist website?
Yeah. They're always fun. I read their really sectarian opinion.
Yeah, they are.
So.
At all? Are you sure? Because they have done all right, so labor journalism really isn't a thing anymore, but insofar as it is done, it's like Labor Notes. And then there's that guy who was the former head of the Bernie campaign. I guess he runs a more perfect union. And then there's World Socialist website. And those are literally the only three people doing labor journalism.
The Northites were the only Trotskyist faction who sided with the councilists on their being anti business union and thus anti-union altogether. But the thing is, I don't know that that's still true because North is no longer around, right? Is he still alive? I don't think so.
I thought he was, but I might be wrong.
He's also, if he is alive, he's ancient.
Yeah.
So let me actually
probably. It's probably a different, it's probably...
no, he's still alive, but he would be 72. So. Yeah,
the report was really rather, it was a very scathing indictment, as, it was a polemic, so,
I mean, that's World Socialist website, but
yeah.
what I want to tell people, I don't hate World Socialist website. I read it knowing its biases. But
Yeah.
often, if you the criticisms of the left of like stuff that's going to backfire, like that's like their criticisms of how badly the 1619 project was going to backfire was absolutely correct.
Yes.
Like, and it's funny because even the Democratic Party wants to bury that shit now. They don't ever bring it up again. Like no one will ever say, because the thing is, people are like, well, critical race theory had no effect. And I'm like, it doesn't have that much effect on education. Actually, was in some trainings, though. You shouldn't lie about that. But no, most teachers don't really understand it. But the 1619 project was critical race theory. Don't lie. Like,
yeah, Trotskyists take some peculiar positions on stuff sometimes. Like, if you recall, like their position on pedophilia, because they say that. I mean, certainly.
Well, that again was Trotskyists. That was the Sparts and a couple other groups who were like, we should abolish all age of consent laws. Because they were anti-queer, and they were used in anti-queer ways in the 70s. So
yeah, well, you know, the point being is that Trotskyists are certainly out there sometimes, but you know,
my other favorite is the Spartacus League's critical support for Al Qaeda in 2000.
Yeah, there's that too, and ISIS. But you know, between when they're not doing that and being absolutely batshit crazy, you know, there is a reason that they're still putting out stuff like, you know, the critiques of like the 1619 project, because, you know, despite whatever flaws some of these Trotskyist sects may have, you know, at least the Northites still understand, you know, the and defend the revolutionary core of you know, American independence in the American Independence Project. And so I guess my whole point in raising the labor notes thing is that it was a scathing indictment on a number of levels of like large, you know, Democratic Party aligned like union politicians essentially trying to like convince their rank and file like that the labor aristocracy isn't a thing, or like if it is, then like it doesn't constitute a big enough problem to actually like prevent you from getting anything done. When I think that you would agree with my assessment that like organized labor was prior to this moment was so on the rocks that there was nowhere to go, nowhere for it to go except either extinct or up, and it chose up. And so we're in this moment, I think, in which there are actually like a fair amount of like hopes on like the post-Sanders left that like this could be a thing. You know, Starbucks has organized over 100 of their stores, even though Democrats.
That's huge.
It's because Democrats work at Starbucks, though. Let's be real.
I mean, what the other thing is, I've been pointing to people that like, but the overall unionization rate has declined since 2020 back down to early to late aughts. Like, we've only had labor gains for the last 10 years. And, you know, and it was only coming down, as we mentioned, from nothing after the decimation of the last of the auto unions. You're right. There was the only place you could go up was up. Like, that's it. But you had to go up in a different way. Like, and yeah.
I guess to touch on what you said about like, you know, the working class not voting. Well, I mean, they do sometimes. And, you know, when they do, it's for Republican populism now. And so, you know, at least from their perspective, you know, with the return of like, you know, the failed promise of a return of like American manufacturing, I'm sure that they saw sort of like left-wing in capital in that. And so there's this whole myth or illusion on large sections of the left that like the working class is just like stupid and they need to have their interests explained to them, when there were like real plausible material reasons for like people not voting for the Democrats or not voting for Sanders last time. And so we're in this moment in like the post Sanders left when obviously the millennial left was pretty all in on this shit. And so like everybody's reeling and everybody is looking for something to sort of cast their lot into when it comes to like, you know, what's next for the left. And, you know, if you think it's going to be not, and when I say you, I mean like the collective you, not you personally, but if people think it's going to be like organized labor and that you aren't going to come up against all of the conservatism of like the existing labor aristocracy and the feebleness of like the reform movements within these unions, coupled with the fact that like the Democrats unions don't even have enough, they don't even exercise enough control over their members to constitute significant voting blocks in anywhere but like traditional union strongholds in like the Northeast and then like Great Lakes states. And then after that, everybody knows that nobody needs labor. And so the left needs to take
Except
really
like the
hard
teachers
look
union and the cop unions, which are not usually the unions you would have think leave from.
Exactly.
So like
the left really needs to take a hard look at like where it's going to choose to cast its lot next, because if it's going to be here, not only are you going to come up against like the accumulated sediment of like your own failed politics and its relationship to the Democratic Party over the last 20 years, but you're also going to come up against the fact that like someone else is just appealing to all of the people that you alleged that you want to appeal to, but they're just doing it much fucking better.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. Like, what people haven't noticed is, I'm like, dude, the conservative populace is peeling off the. The conservative populists are peeling off the Latino vote. Like that's a huge deal. And yeah, it's not true everywhere. It's not going to be like the case in California. Someone was like yelling at me about that when I said, but I'm like, look, even rural areas of California have had like pretty far right takeovers with the working class there not really saying much. So and what we can objectively say is Democratic policies have not helped the working class at all, except for working class child havers for 1 year. So whatever. Like and I think now with Powell being where he is, and the Democrats being associated with what the Fed's doing, whether or not it's fair or not, we're going to have to deal with the fact they're going to have to pay the piper for it. Like, there's no way around that. All right. Yeah. So, I mean, it's going to be interesting to talk about. So on that note, we've been going for a while. This is now 2 long episodes. I'm going to end us off here. Matt will be coming back in the future probably, so you guys can get more of our analysis. Hope you guys have a great day. I'm going to go ahead and date these. Both of these episodes were recorded on the 22nd of June 2022, and that's important because stuff is happening so fast that in a month we might be wrong. So we'll just take note of that. All right. Thank you and have a great day.